The city, a sprawling monument to ambition and decay, always seemed to hum with a low, ceaseless thrum beneath my feet. I, Arthur, an architect by trade, a disillusioned observer by nature, spent my days shaping structures that would inevitably crumble, or at least be deemed obsolete by the next generation of visionaries. My office, a sterile box of glass and steel perched high above the urban sprawl, offered little solace. The air, recycled and tepid, carried the ghost of 1,000 forgotten conversations. My blueprints, crisp lines on vellum, were merely abstract promises, rarely matching the chaotic reality of construction. My life, too, felt like a series of carefully drawn but ultimately unfulfilled plans. One particularly gray afternoon, as rain streaked the immense windows and smeared the city into a watercolor blur, the quiet drone of my existence was pierced. Not by a siren or the clang of distant machinery, but by the insistent, polite ring of my desk phone. A solicitor, his voice a polished gravel, introduced himself. He spoke of a distant relative, a great-aunt's cousin once removed, a name I barely recognized, if at all. The man, a Mr. Elias Thorne, had passed, suddenly, unexplained, and I, Arthur, was his sole heir. My first reaction was a flicker of something akin to annoyance. My routine, my carefully cultivated apathy felt threatened. An inheritance. From a phantom? Yet, as the solicitor's precise words laid out the details, a sprawling estate, isolated, ancient, a different kind of sensation began to unfurl within me. A subtle tightening in my gut, a whisper of unease. He mentioned the estate's local moniker, almost an afterthought. The Maw. The name itself, a gaping, hungry sound, seemed to cling to the air long after he'd concluded the call. I stared at the rain-streaked glass, the city's indifference mirroring my own. But beneath it, a nascent curiosity, dark and sharp, had taken root. The journey was a descent into a forgotten landscape. The highway dwindled to a paved road, then to a gravel track that snaked through skeletal trees. The familiar scent of exhaust fumes gave way to the damp, earthy perfume of ancient woodlands, thick with moss and the rich decay of fallen leaves. The sky, which had been merely overcast, now pressed down, a bruised violet canvas. And then it appeared. Not abruptly, but as if the land itself had exhaled it into being. Its silhouette, a tangle of turrets and gables against the bruised sky, was less imposing than consuming. My architect's eye, trained to see lines and angles, struggled to find order in its sprawling disarray. Windows, countless and varying in size, stared out like vacant eyes, some broken, some merely opaque with age and grime. A sense of immense, suffocating age clung to it. Not just years, but centuries, millennia, as if it had absorbed the very passage of time into its stones. It carried the scent of damp earth, something metallic, and an undercurrent of something else, something indefinable and stale, like forgotten breath. I killed the engine. I stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots, a sound unnaturally loud in the profound stillness. It felt less like I was standing on solid ground, and more like I was poised on the edge of a precipice. The massive oak door, studded with rusted iron, groaned open with a protesting shriek that seemed to echo through the very foundations of the house. Inside, a cavernous hall swallowed the last vestiges of twilight. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the gloom, swirling like phantom snow. The air was frigid, tasting of mildew and something else. A faint, almost sweet, decay. My footsteps on the flagstone floor resonated with an unnerving resonance, each sound magnified, devoured. I wandered, drawn by an unspoken compulsion through vast, echoing rooms. Each space felt lived in, yet abandoned, as if its previous occupants had simply evaporated. Furniture draped in white sheets stood like ghostly sentinels. The silence was broken only by the creak of settling timbers and the soft drip, drip, drip of water somewhere deep within the house. My hands, usually steady, felt a tremor. This was not merely an old house. It was a breathing, watchful entity. As I moved deeper, a faint, persistent hum began to prick at the edges of my hearing. It was a low-frequency vibration, more felt than heard, like the distant drone of some colossal, hibernating machine. The humming grew stronger, a palpable pressure against my eardrums. And then, I found it. Hidden beneath the main structure, a colossal, echoing chamber. They vibrated, emitting the low thrum that filled the space. Beneath them, stretching out into the gloom, lay the vast, empty basin of an abandoned swimming pool under humming lights. Its tiles, once a vibrant cerulean, were now cracked and stained, a mosaic of algae and neglect. The air here was heavy with the scent of stagnant water and something metallic, like old blood. The sheer scale of it, buried beneath the earth, was disorienting, unsettling. Why would such a thing exist here, in this ancient, isolated place? The maw had already begun to claim me. The city, with its ceaseless mechanical breath, had been a cage of my own making, a world of concrete and steel where the only ghosts were the failures of ambition. I, Arthur, stepped further into its cavernous embrace, the heavy oak door groaning shut behind me like a sigh escaping ancient lungs. The air inside was thick, tasting of dust, damp earth, and something else. A faint metallic tang, like old coins left to corrode in the dark. The entrance hall, vast and shadowed, stretched upwards into a gloom where the ceiling was only a rumor. What struck me first was not the decay, though it was abundant, but the subtle wrongness of the proportions. A grand staircase, spiraling upwards, seemed to twist at an impossible angle halfway up, as if a giant hand had subtly warped its spine. Room after room unfolded, each more unsettling than the last. A library with shelves overflowing with leather-bound volumes, their titles obscured by cobwebs, seemed to lean inward, its walls subtly concave. In a grand dining hall, the long, empty table was set for a feast that would never arrive. The silver tarnished black, the crystal glasses clouded with age. It wasn't a draught. The heavy velvet curtains hung motionless, undisturbed by any breeze. Then came the sounds. At first, I dismissed them as the natural creaks and groans of an ancient structure settling. A distant thud, perhaps a floorboard shifting. A soft scraping, like something being dragged across stone far above me. It was not a language I recognized, more a sibilant sigh, a breath held too long and finally released. My rational mind, a fortress I had carefully constructed over years, began to offer explanations. The house's acoustics, the wind, my own overactive imagination fueled by solitude. Days bled into a week, each one deepening the house's hold. I found myself drawn to a hidden passage, concealed behind a tapestry depicting a hunting scene, which led down a flight of uneven stone steps. The air grew heavy with the scent of chlorine and something metallic, almost ozone-like. The passage opened into a vast, cavernous space. Here, the low, persistent hum I had begun to notice throughout the house intensified, a throbbing pulse that vibrated through the very floor beneath my feet. The pool itself was empty, a gaping concrete maw, the air above it thick with a strange, luminescent haze cast by the array of industrial lights fixed high above. Their incessant, low-frequency hum the only sound in the vast, echoing chamber. They pulsed, not with a flicker, but with a subtle, rhythmic dimming and brightening as if breathing. The sight filled me with an inexplicable unease, a sense of something long dormant stirring. Who would build such a place, so deep beneath an ancestral home? And for what purpose? My nights became a fractured landscape of sleep and waking. I would dream of the house itself, not as a static structure, but as a living, breathing entity. Its walls would ripple like water. Its floors would undulate beneath my feet, and the ceilings would press down, threatening to crush me. I would see impossible rooms, corridors that led nowhere, and doors that appeared and vanished with mocking ease. One night, the dream was particularly vivid. The metallic tang in the air was overwhelming, choking. From the depths of the house, a low, guttural moan resonated. Not human, not animal, but something ancient and immense. I held my breath, listening, my heart hammering against my ribs. It sounded like something vast and heavy moving slowly, deliberately, somewhere deep below. I tried to rationalize it away as a residual echo of the dream, a trick of the mind in the liminal space between sleep and waking. But the thumping continued, a slow, inexorable rhythm that felt too real, too physical to be merely imagined. The house, a skeletal hand against the bruised sky, seemed to watch me, its myriad windows like unblinking eyes. A determined chill settled in my marrow, not just from the pervasive damp, but from the insidious knowledge that something here was profoundly, monstrously wrong. I had to understand. The sound led me through a labyrinth of identical doors, each one a potential threshold to another empty room, another layer of stagnation. Here, the hum intensified, a low, persistent thrumming that resonated in my chest. I pressed on, the hum pulling me past the stark, drained pool, towards a section of wall that seemed to recede, a trick of the light perhaps, or a deliberate deception. Dust, disturbed by my touch, swirled in the beam of my torch. A faint click, then the groan of ancient hinges, louder than any thunderclap, announced the opening of a hidden passage. The passage was narrow, leading down a flight of uneven stone steps, each descent deepening the sense of claustrophobia. At the bottom, a heavy, unadorned door stood ajar, revealing a sliver of sepia light. I pushed it open, the movement sending a shiver through the very fabric of the house, or perhaps just through me. The hidden library was a cramped, airless space, shelves crammed with volumes that sagged under the weight of centuries. The air was thick with the dust of forgotten narratives, each particle a silent witness to the house's grim history. My fingers, trembling slightly, reached for a journal. I opened it, the pages crumbling at my touch, releasing a puff of fine gray dust. The script was an ornate, looping hand, difficult to decipher at first. But as my eyes adjusted, words began to coalesce, forming sentences that spoke of strange observations, of peculiar experiments, of an ever-deepening obsession with the house itself. The structure breathes, one entry read, dated nearly 2 centuries past. Its heart beats in the foundations, a slow, deliberate rhythm. My father, before me, spoke of its appetite. Fragmented maps of the house, annotated with cryptic symbols. One entry, stained with what looked like dried tears or ancient watermarks, spoke of the binding ritual, the vessel's preparation, the inevitable descent into the chamber. My breath hitched. The ancestors weren't merely eccentric. They were entangled, deeply and horrifyingly, with this place. They hadn't just lived in the maw, they had served it. The journals hinted at a lineage of custodians, of guardians, of participants in something ancient and terrible. Sacrifice. The journals, meticulously penned in fading ink, had laid bare a lineage of custodians, guardians, not of a house, but for it. They had served the maw, tended to its appetites, prepared the way for its terrible nourishment. A chill, more profound than any draft, settled deep in my bones, a cold hand closing around my throat. I was not just an heir, I was the next offering. A frantic energy, part terror, part grim determination, seized me. It was a place of preparation, of communion, of ultimate surrender. The truth, however horrific, was a tether to reality I desperately needed, even as that reality frayed at the edges. My descent into the estate's forgotten depths began. Moisture beaded on the stone, making the air heavy, clinging to my skin. The air here was a humid, stagnant breath, thick with the smell of chlorine and decay. The pool itself, a colossal rectangle of chipped, pale tiles, held not water, but a viscous, sickly green sludge that reflected the flickering, failing fluorescence above. These lights, ancient and grimy, buzzed with a low, incessant hum, a sound that seemed to vibrate not just in the air, but directly against my teeth. My gaze was drawn to the far end, beyond the skeletal remains of what might have been changing cubicles. There, set into a wall that seemed too solid, too uniform for this decaying place, was a door. It was an iron behemoth, rusted crimson, its surface a tapestry of flaking paint and corrosion. No handle, no visible hinges. It looked less like an entrance and more like a permanent seal. Driven by an urgency that was no longer entirely my own, I examined the door. The journals had mentioned a hidden mechanism, a keyhole disguised as a decorative rivet. With a shiver of recognition, I produced the ornate heavy key I'd found tucked into the spine of the oldest journal. It slid into the hidden lock with a soft click that resonated through the cavernous space. Then came the real effort. The door was not merely locked, it was sealed by decades, perhaps centuries of disuse. I pushed, grunted, straining against the cold metal. Slowly, agonizingly, a hairline crack appeared. With a final desperate heave, the iron door groaned open, scraping a protesting path across the flagstones. It seemed to absorb the light from the humming fluorescence, refusing to yield. I stepped through, my lantern held high. The chamber was not large, but it was vast in its wrongness. The walls were not stone, but a seamless, dull black material that swallowed the light, making the space feel both confined and infinite. In the center, bathed in a faint, pulsing phosphorescence that seemed to emanate from the very air, stood an altar. Carved into its sides were symbols that defied recognition, angular and sharp, yet somehow fluid, as if they shifted when I wasn't looking directly at them. Scattered around the altar and on its surface were the artifacts. A third, a polished stone, was a perfect cube, yet its surfaces seemed to subtly curve, creating the optical illusion of a sphere. My eyes fell upon a collection of bound pages lying open on the altar. The parchment was brittle, the ink faded, but the script was disturbingly familiar from the journals. This was the sacred text, the final testament. The maw hungers, its breath upon the world. The merging, the endless waking. Arthur, the last of the line. The words swam before my eyes, not just on the page, but echoing in the heavy air. The air grew impossibly heavy, thick, as if I were breathing water. It was here, the entity, undeniably palpable, its presence a suffocating weight. I was not alone. I was observed. I was chosen. The line of custodians, of guardians, of participants. It ended with me. And the ritual, centuries in the making, was finally ready. I was not just the next owner. I was the next sacrifice. And the maw was very, very pleased. The low thrumming that had begun in my chest now pulsed through the very floorboards beneath my feet. A vast resonant chord struck deep within the house's stone heart. It was not a sound I heard with my ears, but felt. A pressure building behind my eyes. A cold awareness blooming in the pit of my being. An icy tendril unfurling through my veins. The air, heavy moments before, seemed to thicken into a viscous fluid, each breath a struggle against its unseen weight. A wave of vertigo swept over me, and the room spun, not around me, but through me, as if I were a ghost and the walls merely phantoms. My hand, reaching out for the solid oak of the desk, passed through it for a fleeting, horrifying instant, a sensation of cold air where wood should have been. I gasped, snatching my hand back, clutching it to my chest, my fingers tingling with an echo of non-existence. Panic, a raw, primal thing, began to claw its way up my throat. I pushed myself away from the desk, stumbling backwards, my legs suddenly unreliable. The antique tapestry on the wall rippled, not from a draft, but from within, its woven figures seeming to shift their gazes towards me. Their eyes, once flat thread, now gleaming with a faint, moist sheen. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and they were still, lifeless fabric once more. But the impression lingered, a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. I needed to leave. I needed air, reality, anything outside these crumbling walls. My gaze darted to the window, the one reliable portal to the world beyond. But the landscape outside had changed. The familiar, gnarled oak that stood sentinel on the lawn was gone, replaced by a cluster of skeletal, leafless trees I didn't recognize, their branches like grasping claws against a sky the color of bruised plums. The light was wrong, too. A sickly, jaundiced glow that seemed to emanate from the very air, not from a distant sun. I fumbled for my mobile phone, desperate for a connection, for a voice. Any voice that wasn't my own spiraling thoughts. I walked towards the door, my steps heavy, as if wading through treacle. I cried out, grabbing the railing with both hands, my knuckles white. My breath hitched in my throat, a ragged, terrified sound. Rooms I knew intimately had altered doorways or simply weren't there. A faint, cloying scent of dust and something metallic, like old blood, hung heavy in the air. Where am I going? I mumbled, my voice cracking. I had intended to reach the front door, to simply walk out, but the house seemed to be guiding me, or perhaps misguiding me, with an unseen, malevolent hand. The faint, persistent hum grew louder here, a low, resonant drone that vibrated in my teeth. The scent of chlorine, long stagnant, now mingled with the damp earth. The water, what little remained, was a stagnant, murky green, reflecting the sickly yellow glow of the lights. Rust stained the diving boards, and algae clung to the cracked ceramic. The air here was heavy with the smell of decay and forgotten leisure, a stark contrast to the elegant decay of the main house. My reflection shimmered in the stagnant water, distorted and elongated, like a funhouse mirror image. But it wasn't just my reflection. It was tall, impossibly thin, its edges blurring into the surrounding gloom. The figure in the water rippled, its form shifting, stretching, reaching towards my reflection with an elongated skeletal arm. I could feel its presence, a profound emptiness that promised to swallow me whole. The humming lights above intensified their drone, the sound now a deafening roar inside my skull, vibrating through my very bones. When I dared to open them again, the pool was still there. The humming lights still flickered, but the figure in the water was gone. Only my own terrified reflection stared back at me, a stranger with wide, haunted eyes. The house was not merely distorting reality. It was bleeding its past into my present, blurring the lines of what was and what had been, twisting them into something monstrous and new. The faces in the portraits, once faded ancestors, now watched with unnervingly familiar eyes, their painted smiles twisting into something predatory, something I almost recognized from my own reflection. One particular visage, that of a woman with high cheekbones and a severe bun, seemed to beckon, her gaze piercing the gloom. It was a folly, I knew, to follow such an illusion. Yet a strange, cold certainty pulled me, an instinct sharper than fear. Beneath the heavy frame, my hand brushed against a subtle indentation in the wainscoting, an anomaly in the otherwise seamless wood. This house, this monstrous entity, wanted me to find something. It was leading me, perhaps, to my own undoing. But I would walk that path with open eyes. I pressed the spot. A faint click, like a bone snapping in a silent room, echoed, and a section of the wall beside the portrait slid inward with a groan of ancient mechanisms, revealing a narrow, pitch-black passage. Each step was carved from rough-hewn stone, worn smooth in the center, as if countless feet had trod this path over centuries. This was no mere hidden room. This was a descent. I moved, a phantom in my own skin, down the spiraling steps. Stone shelves lined the walls, laden with dust-shrouded artifacts, crumbling leather-bound books, rusted iron implements whose purpose I dared not guess, and desiccated bundles of what looked like herbs, their faint, bitter aroma cutting through the stench of decay. My gaze was drawn to a central stone altar, scarred and discolored, upon which lay a single massive ledger, its covers bound in what felt like dried, flayed hide. This was it, I knew. The source, the core. I reached for the ledger, my fingers trembling, not from fear alone, but from the immense gravity of the moment. The pages crackled as I turned them, a dry whisper in the cavern. The entries were dated centuries apart, written by different hands, yet all shared a common, terrifying thread. They spoke not of a curse, but of a pact. My ancestors, the architects of this terrible legacy, were not victims of the house, but its willing collaborators. Something that required the periodic renewal of the bond. The inheritance, the sudden, inexplicable death of the distant relative, my own inexplicable draw to this place. It all clicked into a horrifying mosaic. My ancestors had not merely lived in this house, they had served it. And now, the ledger's final, most recent entries, penned in a hand I recognized as belonging to the deceased relative, spoke of the new vessel, the final sacrifice to seal the cycle. I was the new vessel. I was the final sacrifice. A guttural cry tore from my throat, raw and desperate. My family, my lineage, was not a line of victims, but a dynasty of monstrous priests tending to an unholy god. I slammed the ledger shut, the sound echoing in the crypt like a death knell. I burst from the hidden passage, gasping, into the relative familiarity of the corridor, which now seemed less impossibly long, but infinitely more sinister. My mind reeled, a kaleidoscope of ancient betrayals and impending doom. I fled, not knowing where I was going, only that I had to move, to outrun the truth if I could not escape its clutches. The air here was thick with a metallic tang, sharper than in the crypt, and carried a faint, sweet undertone that made my stomach churn. In the center of the empty basin, a single rusted drain cover gaped like a hungry maw. My breath hitched. The maw. Not just the house, but this place. This was where the final act, the renewal, took place. I stood at the edge of the pool, gazing into its empty depths, a profound and horrifying understanding settling over me. My ancestors hadn't just made a pact, they had built a stage. And I, Arthur, was the star of the final bloody performance. My inheritance was not a gift, but a summons. And the curtain, I realized with a sickening certainty, was about to rise. The raw, guttural cry that had torn from my throat withered into a raspy whisper, then nothing at all. The air, thick with the stale breath of ages, seemed to press against my lungs, stealing the very will to breathe. I was the new vessel. I was the final sacrifice. The words echoed not in the room, but in the hollow chambers of my skull, a grotesque liturgy whispered by my ancestors. Their complicity, a vast, suffocating shroud settled upon me, woven from centuries of blood spilled and faith twisted. My family, not victims, but monstrous priests, tending a horror I could only now begin to comprehend. I was no longer merely a man trapped in a house. I was prey, a chosen offering. And the maw, this hungry, ancient thing, knew it. It felt my understanding, my reluctant acceptance of its grim reality, and it began to stir with a newfound terrible energy. The very timbers of the house groaned around me. not with the familiar creaks of age, but with a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated through the floorboards into the soles of my feet. It was a sound of awakening, of stretching limbs. They danced on the periphery of my vision, solidifying just enough to suggest gaunt, reaching figures before dissolving back into the gloom. A sudden sharp crack echoed from the wall beside me like a bone snapping. I flinched, my gaze darting to the plaster. A hairline fissure, thin as a spider silk, had appeared, snaking upward. As I watched, mesmerized by its impossible speed, it widened, the plaster crumbling inward with a soft, dusty sigh. I spun, my hands instinctively rising, but there was nothing. This was no longer just atmosphere. It was an active assault. The floor beneath me seemed to undulate, a subtle, sickening sway that made me grasp for the nearest doorframe. The wood felt rough, almost alive, as if the grain itself was shifting under my touch. My architectural mind, usually so precise, buckled under the impossible geometry. The very structure, once a testament to human design, was becoming a mockery, a living, breathing trap. A low, wet, slithering sound began to emanate from deeper within the house, growing steadily louder, accompanied by a rhythmic, heavy thud. It sounded like something vast and boneless dragging itself across stone. The air grew heavy, cloying, thick with a scent I could only describe as ancient decay mixed with ozone, like the air before a lightning strike, but infinitely more sinister. I stumbled back, my mind screaming for an exit, any exit. The house was pushing me, guiding me with its malevolent will. The slithering sound intensified, growing closer, forcing me down a corridor I hadn't intended to take, away from the familiar, toward something unknown. The hum of the house became a high-pitched whine, vibrating in my teeth. The empty pool, a colossal concrete maw itself, stretched out below, its mosaic tiles stained with algae and time. Then another. And another. Each drop sent ripples across the oily surface, distorting the reflections of the humming lights into elongated, wavering specters. Then I saw it. In the deepest part of the pool, where the light struggled to penetrate, a form began to coalesce. It writhed, a tangled mass of elongated limbs and bulbous, sightless protrusions, slowly rising from the depths. It pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence, an unholy glow that revealed the grotesque undulations of its impossible anatomy. It was vast, filling the bottom of the pool, pressing against the very concrete. It was a sound of ancient hunger, of malice distilled. This was the source, the heart of the maw, manifesting in its true, horrifying glory. My breath hitched, trapped in my throat. My vision blurred at the edges, my grip on reality fraying. The house groaned, the pool lights buzzed, and the thing in the depths began to pull itself upward, its grotesque form stretching towards me, towards its final vessel. The ritual was not merely ongoing, it was upon me, and I was the central helpless figure. I was the new vessel. I was Arthur. I would not simply yield. They contained the fragmented ramblings of those who had fought, who had tried to understand, who had sought a means of resistance, however futile. Obscure symbols, half-formed incantations, references to forgotten materials, a desperate lexicon of rebellion. My mind, a frayed tapestry of fear and frantic logic, latched onto these threads. There had to be a way, a reversal, a severing. The vast, tiled basin stretched before me, a gaping maw of its own, echoing the house's hunger. A low, persistent hum vibrated through the air, a sound both mechanical and strangely organic, as if the very light was breathing. I clutched the heavy tome, its leather binding cracked, its pages brittle beneath my trembling fingers. My eyes, darting across the faded script, sought out the most promising passages. A sequence of sigils, a particular arrangement of dried herbs, though I had none. I had only my voice, my will, and the faint, desperate hope that this ancient evil could be reasoned with. or, failing that, broken. With a trembling hand, I began to draw. Using a shard of broken tile, I etched the first symbol onto the grimy concrete floor beside the pool's edge. I ignored it, focusing on the next stroke. I pressed on, my movements becoming more frantic, a race against the tightening knot in my stomach. I outlined a perimeter, a fragile barrier of chalky dust and desperate intent. The air grew heavier, thick and cloying, as if the very atmosphere was resisting my efforts. My lungs burned with each shallow breath. The low hum of the lights seemed to intensify, vibrating not just in the air but directly against my eardrums. A dull, throbbing pressure. Then I began to speak. They felt alien on my tongue, tasting of dust and despair. The symbols I had painstakingly drawn seemed to ripple, their edges blurring in the periphery of my vision, as if the very concrete was shifting beneath them. I pushed harder, pouring every ounce of my dwindling resolve into the final binding phrase. "Let this pact be undone," I rasped, the words tearing from my throat raw and desperate. The response was not violent, not explosive. It was far more insidious, far more crushing. And my words, they withered. The sounds I had uttered, meant to be potent, to be disruptive, simply dissolved into nothingness. They carried no weight, no resonance. The sigils I had drawn, meant to protect, to repel, began to fade before my eyes, not rubbed away, but simply erased. Their chalky lines seemed to sink into the concrete, leaving no trace, as if they had never been. A profound, soul-crushing despair washed over me, heavier than any physical weight. My knees buckled. My breath caught, lodged in my throat. I had tried. I had fought. And in return, the house, the entity, had not even deigned to acknowledge my resistance with anger. It had simply absorbed my efforts, effortlessly, utterly. It had demonstrated its power not through a roar, but through an indifferent, absolute negation. I was not merely defeated. I was rendered meaningless. My desperate measures were nothing more than a child's tantrum against a titan. It was not just an absence of light, but a presence of crushing inevitability. I was alone, truly alone, in a way I had never conceived possible. The house had not merely rejected my efforts, it had consumed them, and with them, the last flickering ember of my hope. The vessel was ready. The sacrifice was prepared. And I, Arthur, was utterly, irrevocably lost. I was the new vessel. They were not a thought, but a fundamental truth etched into the marrow. It was the call of the maw, a silent, ravenous hunger that had finally found its echo within me. My feet, heavy and reluctant, yet moved. I drifted through the labyrinthine passages, the very architecture seeming to shift, to breathe with a slow, calcified rhythm around me. The tiles, once cerulean, were now a mosaic of green algae and creeping verdigris, and the air here was heavy with the chlorine's ghost and the cloying sweetness of decay. I averted my gaze, compelled onward, away from that disturbing mirror. The sensation in my hands began, subtle at first, a faint tingling, as if dormant nerves were awakening to an alien current. Then a peculiar rigidity. My fingers, once pliant, felt stiff, the skin over my knuckles stretching taut, almost brittle. I flexed them, and the movement was less fluid, more deliberate, like the creak of old timber. I brought one hand closer to my face, and beneath the surface, a subtle hardening, a density that had not been there before. It was as if my very flesh was beginning to calcify, to become something resilient, something enduring, yet utterly unhuman. This was not merely the house affecting my mind. It was working its insidious artistry upon my physical form. This was the transformation. This was the preparation. I looked at my reflection in a tarnished brass plate affixed to a nearby door. My jawline seemed sharper, more angular. The skin stretched taut across my cheekbones, lending my face a gaunt, almost predatory aspect. My eyes, once weary, now held a deep, unsettling clarity, as if gazing into truths no mortal should comprehend. I touched my face, and the skin felt cool, strangely smooth, like polished rock. It was as I had left it, yet profoundly altered by the new truth I carried within me. And there, at the heart of it all, was the altar. It no longer looked like a mere slab of obsidian. The magnetic pull intensified, becoming an irresistible tide. I moved towards it, my body no longer entirely my own, a puppet on strings woven from ancient malevolence. It was not pain, but a profound, invasive sensation, as if my very essence were being reshaped, compressed, honed. I lifted my hands, the fingers stiff and alien, and saw that the faint grayish cast had deepened, and along the veins on my forearms, a faint, almost metallic sheen had begun to appear. My skin felt like cooled lava, hard and unyielding. The realization settled upon me with the weight of a collapsing tomb. I was not merely being led to the altar. I was becoming part of it. I was being prepared, not just as a sacrifice, but as a vessel, a living conduit. The house was not just claiming me. It was remaking me, twisting my human form into something capable of containing the ancient, malevolent presence it served. The ultimate ritual was not merely my end, but my grotesque, agonizing transformation into an instrument of its eternal hunger. I was the new vessel. The air here was a thick, viscous thing, clinging to my skin like a shroud of wet clay. It smelled of stagnant water, of forgotten chlorine, and something else. A faint, cloying sweetness that made the back of my throat ache. Above, a grid of fluorescent tubes, aged and flickering, cast a sickly, yellowish pallor over the scene. Their hum was not a steady drone, but a discordant, pulsing throb that resonated deep in my chest. A rhythm that was not my own. It was not mere water. I felt its ancient weight, its patient hunger. My breath hitched, a shallow, desperate intake. My lungs felt too small for this air, too fragile for the pressure that bore down on me. They spoke in a language I could not comprehend, yet their meaning was terrifyingly clear. Submission. A profound, resonant vibration began to emanate from the pool's depths, a bass note that bypassed my ears entirely and vibrated through the soles of my feet, up my spine, and into the core of my skull. It felt like the very foundation of the world was shifting, groaning under an unbearable strain. The humming lights above intensified their whine, pushing it to a shrill crescendo that made my teeth ache. My vision blurred, the yellow glow distorting into wavering columns that stretched and writhed. Then, from the murky water, something began to rise. No, not yet. A spark, a desperate ember of defiance flickered within me. This was my essence, myself, and I would not yield it without a fight, however futile. My muscles, stiff and unresponsive moments before, screamed in protest as I tried to move, to turn, to flee. I pushed, I strained, a guttural groan tearing from my throat, but the grip tightened, an invisible vice closing around my limbs, my torso, my very will. The air grew impossibly heavy, crushing. The sweetness in the air became sickly, metallic, like the taste of old blood in my mouth. I felt its ancient hunger, its patient, centuries-long wait for this moment. It was not consuming my flesh, but something far more precious, far more intrinsic. My consciousness, my memories, the very unique spark that was Arthur. It was a slow, agonizing dissolution, a merging that was not union but absorption. I felt my thoughts begin to fray, my past unraveling like a forgotten tapestry. My struggle became a silent, internal scream. My body was no longer my own, held rigid, a puppet for an unseen puppeteer. The air itself seemed to sing with a triumphant, discordant harmony, It was not a violent tearing, but a subtle, insidious draining, like sand through an hourglass, grain by precious grain. The final, horrifying truth dawned with crystalline clarity. The ritual was complete. And through me, the maw would now truly begin to feed. I was the new vessel. A new tenant had moved in, and it was not me. When awareness finally coalesced, it was around the sharp, metallic tang of ozone and the persistent, low thrum that vibrated deep within my sternum. My eyes, or what I perceived as my eyes, opened to a vast, cavernous space, its dimensions swallowed by the murky gloom that clung to the upper reaches. The lights themselves were a series of naked bulbs, strung carelessly overhead, each encased in a cage of rusted wire. It was the house, breathing. It was me, breathing. The air was thick with the scent of stagnant water, damp earth, and something else. A faint, sweet decay that clung to the tongue, a cloying perfume of ancient, forgotten things. My own body felt like a borrowed garment, ill-fitting and unfamiliar. I lifted a hand, observing the elongated fingers, the pallid skin, the faint, almost imperceptible tremor that ran through them. They were mine, yet not. They were an extension of something far older, far hungrier. Now it merely pulsed in sync with the house, with the entity that had claimed me. My architect's eye, once so keen on structure and form, now perceived the pool not as a man-made construct, but as a stomach, a vast, hungry maw waiting to be fed. I walked to the edge of the pool, my reflection shimmering back at me from the inky surface. It was Arthur, yes, but twisted. My lips, parted slightly, felt dry, stretched. A silent, insatiable hunger gnawed at the edges of my new consciousness. I was no longer merely Arthur. I was the new threshold, the living gate. The house had not simply consumed me. It had integrated me, made me a part of its intricate, horrifying machinery. The maw had found a new tongue, a new set of eyes, a new form through which to perceive and to draw in. They were not just parts of a dilapidated building. They were the nascent teeth of a new, emerging predator. It was content for now. It had what it needed. I was not a sacrifice, not in the traditional sense. I was a perpetuation. My purpose was clear, etched into the very fibers of my being. To lure, to entice, to draw in the unsuspecting, just as I had been drawn. The house, my house, would expand its reach, its influence seeping out, a silent, unseen tendril snaking through the world, seeking new sustenance. And I, Arthur, was its newest creation. The cycle had not ended. It had merely found a new vessel, a more refined instrument. And somewhere, out there, another soul, unsuspecting and full of life, was already beginning its slow, inevitable drift towards the hungry maw that now wore my face. The hum intensified, a silent promise.